For the next lesson, I'm going to be in aperture priority, and we're going to start talking about the focusing modes. The easiest way for me to break this down is to say it in the how, the when, and the where. How, when, and where. If you think of focusing in those three terms, this is going to be easy. The first part of this is how does the camera focus? There's actually a number of different ways we can do it. Again, we talked about using a halfway shutter button depression, where we push just into that spongy resistance. The camera starts focusing, and it's indicated with this green box and a beep. We can also push the AF on button, also achieving focus lock. And we can also try to focus. It's having a hard time focusing here, but we can also touch on the monitor. So those are three different ways in terms of the how. Halfway shutter button depression, AF on, touch on the monitor. Now let's talk about the when the camera is focusing. How, when, and where, right? So the when is how often the camera is engaging the focusing systems. And this deals with what is called the focusing modes. Right now, we can access our camera's focusing modes by pressing the Q button and coming here to the second box right here. There's one shot, AI focus, and AI servo. One shot means that the camera is going to achieve focusing lock one time. And then if we push and hold the shutter button halfway down, the focus will not change. In fact, if we get a focusing lock and we rotate the camera, so if I focus here and I move the camera, the focus will not change. This is great for subject matter that is still and cooperating. And so people will say, why would you want to change the position of your camera? Well, you might have a person sitting in the middle of your screen, you get a focusing lock, and we can recompose it to make it more aesthetically pleasing. We have the person over here, like if you're short on time, you get a focus lock, boom. And then when you're ready to take the picture, push it down all the way. So when we're talking about one shot, it means that the camera will focus one time. I'll do it with the back button. Here's the focus lock, and I can move the camera, push the shutter button down all the way to take the picture. That's the heart of the matter with one shot. You get one focusing lock. Now, if I come in and I go to servo, it's different. When I engage focusing, you'll notice that it's not a green box, it's a blue box now. And servo mode is different in that it focuses over and over and over again as long as we are engaging the focusing systems. This is great for sports and fast moving subjects where their position is changing. Maybe we're dealing with children who are small, running around. We want to shoot them on servo mode because as long as we're engaging that, the camera will update their focusing systems. It'll continue to focus on it over and over and over again. You'll notice we don't get a beep, no green box. That's the key indicator of the differences, still subject matter versus moving subject matter. Now, I also want to make a point about this. There's a hybrid mode in here called AI focus. AI focus is the camera's attempt to blend the two together, where you have one shot in servo. There was a time, I would try to shoot this way when I was dealing with a dancing bride. She's moving and now she's stopped, or she's moving again, now she's stopped. Now, the problem with this is that we're turning this over to the camera. We're telling the camera, I want you to decide whether we're dealing with a still or a moving subject. And sometimes the camera can get confused and you'll miss. For that reason, I rarely use AI focus. If I'm dealing with any subject matter that might be moving, I'm on servo. Servos can still work fine, if the subject's still, it's fine. But this way, the camera is not making the decision, it's not hesitating, and it just seems more consistent when you specifically choose between the two of those. So that is the when the camera is focusing. We talked about the how, we've talked about the when. Now let's talk about the where. The where deals with the camera's focusing clusters. The clusters can be accessed by pushing this corner button right here. We can also access them by coming up to the top right here. You will see them on the bottom of your screen. The way this works is these are different sizes. If we were to go through them real quick, we have spot AF, which is a very small square. It's teeny tiny. It's great for shooting birds that have landed in shrubbery where you need a precise focus, for example. Then we have a slightly, it's going to let me do this. Then we have a slightly larger square, 1-point autofocus. Then we have an expanded area autofocus. We have these 4 boxes around it. And then we have expanded AF area around. All that we're doing is we're selecting a larger area to choose from. We also have these customizable flexible zone AF 1, 2, and 3. Why do I say customizable? If we hit this rate feature, which is also this button up here, and we rotate either of our selectors, we can change the size and shape of those focusing clusters. For example, if you're shooting birds in flight and they're mostly in the center of the frame here, we're telling the camera to only look in this area. See, the camera's starting to look there. I have my tracking on. I'm going to turn that off in a second. Very useful if you need to designate specific areas for birds in flight. Let's try that again. We want to go like that. Pretty amazing. And then at the very end, whole area AF is overlooked. This is going to look at the entire frame, and it's going to look for an area of contrast. So it likes this left side of the blinds. Very good for shooting birds in flight when you're shooting into a bright sky and there's not a lot of foliage behind them. Definitely something that you should use and be aware of. Also good for eye detection if you're dealing with a single subject. So this is the where. These are our camera's focusing clusters. We can also designate the exact location by using the joystick, moving it around. We can touch on the screen to tell the camera, hey, look in this one spot. So that is the where, which deals with the camera's focusing clusters. Super useful. Now, having said all that, there are a number of other secondary focusing features that you should be aware of. For example, when we press the focusing clusters, you can see we got this info on, info off. So now when it says on, this is a tracking feature. You can see that the box will start to grow and it will start to move around. Let me put a focusing square up there to demonstrate this a little bit better. I've put a focusing square up there, and keep in mind that our tracking is turned to on. I'm in servo. I'm going to hit the AF on button. It's going to engage it, and you can see that as I'm moving, the focusing square is more or less staying locked on it. So when you're dealing with subject matter on clean backgrounds that's moving, this might be the way to go. Single bird in flight on a bright background sky. You can see that it's moving. So what happens when we turn this to off? Well, now when we get the focusing lock, you can see that the square doesn't stay locked on it. It's just going to focus where we have the square positioned. And that's the difference between tracking and non-tracking. So let me come in here and turn it back to on. And then we're going to come in and we are going to turn to one shot. So one shot doesn't work with tracking. You can see that even though I have tracking on, nothing's happening. It only works with servo, or if we're getting AI focus and it's able to track a moving subject. Suffice it to say, the tracking does not work with one shot. So we're going to turn this back to servo. Let's talk a little bit about face and eye detection. This is going to be size dependent in your viewfinder. So if you're trying to shoot somebody who's very far away or they're very small, it's usually pretty small, but if they're far away enough, it's not going to work. I'm going to zoom in and close to show you. Just had somebody email me this morning asking me how to be more specific about where face detection works. So in the beginning, be aware that your face detection is in this menu setting, subject to detect. Typically it's on auto. And if we have a large or the whole area AF, you can see that it automatically jumps on to the eye. So even as I move to the left and right, we get sort of like this tracking where the camera's keeping track over which eye. So when you're using the whole area AF and you have eye detection turned on, the camera is previewing subject matter with an eye to detect. If I push AF on, I'm in the servo mode. You can see that it has this automatic tracking. It's engaging. What do these arrows mean? These arrows are allowing to designate which eye we're focusing on. eye detection is an absolute game changer for portrait photographers if you've never used one, a camera that has this feature. When we were shooting DSLRs, we would have to put the focusing square on their eye and then we'd recompose, and it was a nightmare. But now what we're seeing is that we're getting almost edge to edge. See how it jumped to the face detection, but we're almost getting edge to edge detection for eye detection. Now, this is going to get a little bit more complicated as you have more and more people in your shot and you want to be specific about who you're focusing on. There's a different way that I recommend doing this, is that instead of going with a whole area, is that you would come into a flexible zone. I hit the rate button. I can control the size of my zone, right? Hit OK. And now I can be very specific about who I'm focusing on. It's still jumping on me because there's only one face, but if there was a second face here, I could tell the camera to focus on this person's eye, right? So that's a very important thing to know, is that we have the ability to get very specific about face or eye detection depending on the cluster we're using. Smaller cluster, right? So as I put that cluster over my eye, my model's eye here, it's more focusing on that. It still recognizes face detection. I wonder how specific it would be. Yeah. Now there is a better way to set this up, because when you turn eye detection on globally, the camera may, look into some bushes and shrubbery and say, hey, there's a pattern of a face in here. So what I typically do is I customize the star button to be eye detection. The way we do that is we're going to come out here. We're going to go into our Q menu, hit this, customize buttons. I'm going to come down. This guy, the flash exposure lock, and I'm going to come over until I see a autofocus. There it is. There. So what this allows me to do is to activate eye detection by pushing the star button. So what we'll do is we'll come in and we'll turn off this. So now we have dual back button focusing, where the AF on is engaging normal focusing. See, there's no eye detection. It has tracking, but if I wanted to go into eye detection, now I push the star button, it jumps right into it. This is how I typically recommend setting it up, because now you have a portrait focusing, you have a regular focusing. Very, very powerful. Another customization that I really, really like, that I've made videos about, is if you remember that depth of field preview button that we have in front of the camera. Let me come in here. I really like to set that up to be my focus cluster selector, that I can cycle through different clusters. Let's see if we can find that thing. There it is. It's depth of field preview. I'm going to come in here, and now I'm going to go to cluster cycling. Come back out, hit my info button. Now what I can do is I can push that depth of field preview, and I can cycle through my clusters directly and very quickly. So here I have my regular focusing. Now I can go to a bigger square. Now I can go to eye detection. I can go to regular focus. This is what you're going to want to do, especially as a wildlife or a bird photographer, to be able to cycle and jump through your focusing modes, your focusing types very, very quickly. Now, because I have focusing clusters with my depth of field preview, I don't really need this guy. So what I typically do for this customization, and you don't have to do this, these are just recommendations. Come into my buttons, and I am going to change the cluster button to my focusing mode button. This one here. Why? Because now when I'm shooting, I can designate between one shot or servo very quickly. Here's my one shot. Now I'm in servo, right? Gives tremendous speed and flexibility in changing your focusing squares. Having said all this, there's even more focusing techniques that I want to demonstrate, because I want you to know as many of these as you can. And on the crash course, I will demonstrate how I use these different techniques in different shooting situations. This next one deals with manual focusing. Now we can try to focus manually. You'll see as I rotate the manual focusing wheel, nothing's happening. So if I flip it over to manual focus, we can change our focus directly here. But what I like to do is a technique called manual zoom focusing, where I push the magnifying glass. I can zoom in. And we do this by putting the square over where we want. You only see the square in autofocus. Flip it over to manual. Now I hit the zoom button and I'm punching in on the eye of our model. I shoot manual focus a lot for video, but now that we're punched in, I can rotate the focusing wheel on the lens and I can get a tack sharp focus. I guess that picture is a little blurry, but it's something like that. So that is the manual zoom focus technique. But there's yet another one. If we come into the menu and we come up to the purple tab, which deals with our focusing systems, a lot of this is stuff that we've seen already, tracking and whatnot. Keep coming over to this feature here. So this is manual focus peaking settings. And if I come in here and turn this to on, and I have a red color, when I come out, you can now see there's a little red highlight wherever the camera is focusing. And this deals with looking at contrast. So if I were to focus out, you can see that the peaking disappears. As I get sharper and sharper focus, we get a clearer and clearer red outline. We can change the colors of our focus peaking. Let's do yellow. Now we have a yellow outline. See, kind of lose some of it as we focus out. Should be there. Look at the eyes. There it is. Now, if I punch in and I zoom in and try to use peaking, you don't see it, so just be aware of that. But that is peaking focus. Again, very super powerful stuff. And we also have some other tools in here. One's called the focusing guide. We'll turn that on so I can demonstrate it. I used this on a video shoot way back when. I don't use it anymore. But when you rotate your manual focus ring, you're telling the camera to look in this square, and when those arrows are all pointing at each other and it turns green, that's another way that you know you're in focus. So there's so many different ways to focus the camera. There's autofocus, there's servo, there's one shot, there's tracking, there's different squares. But I've tried to break this down into the easiest in terms of the how, the when, the where. And then we talked about some of the manual focusing techniques. This is all for stills and video. We're going to talk about the video stuff in just a second because there's slightly different things in the video mode. One last thing I want to point out, and this is a question I get a lot. Go back into regular focus. Turn this guy off. Turn this one to off. Is that many sports shooters will ask me, how do you use dedicated back button focus? This guy for sport shooting. The way you do it is you remove autofocus from the shutter button. I do not recommend that if you're a pure beginner, but I'm going to show you how to do it because at some point you may want to if you get into heavy sport shooting. Customize button. Here it is right here, the shutter button. Any button that you're looking to customize, it'll be highlighted in white. So as I rotate through this, you can see the different buttons available for customization. Too bad we can't do the rate button because I would customize that a little differently. But to get dedicated back button focus, we remove autofocus from the halfway shutter button depression by just choosing the metering icon. What this does is it tells the camera to not engage focus when we push the shutter button halfway down. I'm pushing it halfway down and nothing's happening. We push the AF on button, now we get focus. Sports shooters do this for a particular reason to make sure that they are in control of when the camera is focusing versus it's not. So it's focusing, 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 lift the thumb up, it's no longer focusing. And if they shoot by recomposing, the focal plane should be in the same ballpark area. It's just a faster way to manipulate focus versus manual focus. If you set that up and you forget about it, you're going to think your camera's broken. So you're going to be like, why isn't my camera focusing? What's going on? Well, it's because you took off the focusing from the shutter button when you go back to shoot portraits or whatever. So if that happens, check your lens switch, make sure you did not customize that. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the how, the when, and the where of general focusing for stills. We talked about how you do it, the focusing modes, and the focusing clusters. Now, because we're on the subject matter of focusing, I want to talk about focusing specifically in video mode. So you'll notice that we get eye detection, and this is really great, especially if you're a talking head kind of content creator. I do that a lot. So when I'm shooting myself, I want that eye detection turned on with my servo AF on. And what this will do is it will track your face as you move to and from side to side of the viewfinder, which means the camera should always be in focus. A lot of times we have to shoot in manual, which means the focus will not change. Like if you have multiple people in the frame, probably better to do on manual because you don't want the camera jumping around from person to person. But for a single person, we have servo AF. Something to keep in mind, I'll be giving many demonstrations on the crash course about how to focus with video. Something else we can do is we can do our manual focusing. We flip it over. We can do the punch in. Again, all of these techniques are pretty much more or less the same. We can do peaking focus that we talked about. Come back out. But there is another technique I want to demonstrate using servo AF called the rack zoom focus technique, and I need to set it up real quick. So in this example, I have set it up to have this focusing target here in my face over here. I have face detection on. Obviously, maybe I don't want to have face detection on, so I would come into my Q menu, turn that off, and then I would choose a single focusing square. This is typically how I would do a rack zoom. You see it in Hollywood all the time, where they're jumping focus from one subject matter to another. Remember, this is a touchscreen monitor. So in 2014, when the Canon 70D first came out, I still remember how shocked I was because it did it so well, and it's only gotten better that we can touch on the screen and the camera will jump focus. In Hollywood, typically the person that does this is called the first AC, first assistant camera operator. And they usually use sophisticated gears and pins to manipulate the focus. But now, because we have these touch monitor screens and very quiet focusing motors, we can shift the focus simply by going servo AF and touching on the monitor. And I'll give some more demonstrations about this on the crash course. Very powerful technique. Now, because we're here and we're going to talk about video a little bit, I'm going to flip this over to the manual mode and give you the setup for video shooting. So there's something very important about your shutter speed when you are shooting video. So I'm shooting at 30 frames per second. In this case, I can hit my Q button. I can come into my setup of my resolution. I'm shooting 4K, 29.97 frames per second. And I'm shooting with a compression of IPB, which is an interframe compression, which means the camera is looking at the previous and the next frames to try to figure out what's changed, and it's compressing accordingly. It's a lot to go into. I talk more about it on the crash course, but suffice it to say 4K 30 frames per second. Now, because I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, I want my shutter speed to be double the inverse. 30 frames per second times 2 is 60. Put that under an inverse, it's 1/60th. So if you change your frame rate, for example, let's say I shoot at 120 frames per second, then I would shoot at about 1/250th of a second to maintain that rule. It's called the 180-degree shutter rule. You multiply your frames per second and you invert it. So if I'm shooting at 120, it'd be 240 or 250, 1/250th. In this case, I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, so I'm at 1/60th. Then I dial in my aperture. Touch on here. Let's shoot with a wide aperture. Once I have my aperture, then I do my final tweaking with my ISO. And that's how I set up the camera. Follow the 180-degree shutter rule, aperture, ISO, and obviously I'd be using lighting as well. I'm going to jump back over to stills mode.